behalf of the Smart Freight Center, welcome to our Smart Freight Center Leadership Series, and thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, Matt Rurda is not able to be here. He's attending part of his other job, which is PhD defense. But I'm Dr. Judy Farvolden, Executive Director of the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. It's my pleasure to host this presentation on Matt's behalf. This presentation is one in an exciting series we have showcasing leadership in freight and goods movement. And I want to thank the University of Toronto Student ITE chapter for letting us use their weekly time to host a seminar series. It gives us pleasure to be a part of that series and to have them and their audience join us, as well as all the people who are particularly interested in freight and goods movement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. As Usman said, the session is being recorded, and the recordings will be shared on the Smart Freight Center website. And we will have a Q&A following the seminar. So please hold any questions until the end, and then I'll keep an eye on the chat and the hands up and call you after Lynette's talk. So about oh, God bless me. I'm just going to read this. The Smart Freight Center is a collaborative research network co-located at McMaster University, the DeGroote School of Business, Ryerson University, the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute, and the York University Lausanne School of Engineering. It was established in 2019 with seed money from the region of Peel. Its mission is to improve the economic vibrancy of business, environmental sustainability, and quality of life for residents of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which we call home, by providing innovative evidence-based research, decision support, advocacy training, and monitoring in order to coordinate transportation infrastructure, land development, regulation, technology tools, and resources that improve goods movement activities. And it's unique in our region, unique in our country, and not unique in the world, which gives us an opportunity to bring in speakers like Lynette Cheah, whom we are pleased to welcome as our guest speaker. Professor Cheah will present carbon footprint assessment of cross-border e-commerce shipping options. She's an associate professor of engineering systems at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, where she directs the Sustainable Urban Mobility Research Laboratory, which develops data-driven models and tools to reduce the environmental impacts of passenger and urban freight transportation. She is currently associate editor for the Journal of Industrial Ecology and review editor for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Annual Assessment Report. Welcome, Lynette. Let me stop sharing and let you get going.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this seminar series. So very excited to be here and to see the great turnout. So it's evening time here. If my voice trails off, please forgive me, but I'll try to stay upbeat for everyone. So let me share my screen. I hope you can see. Here we go. All good? Excellent. Great. So I'm here today to share a bit more about cross-border e-commerce shipping options and the carbon footprint associated with some of these options. So let's explore this topic a little bit. First of all, I want to acknowledge my master's student, Chiu Hong Huang, who was part of she developed this topic as part of a thesis, and we worked on this together. So it's great that she was able to do this as part of her master's in urban science and public policy at my university. So let's jump in to explore a bit more. Just to give some more background about myself and my lab, I think Judy had already given a very kind introduction. Maybe I'll share with you just a flavor of some of the research projects that we've been working on, other than the topic that I'm introducing today. So the lab does a lot of work on transport modeling and simulation. We're also quite keen on sustainability assessments of different products and systems. So some of the recent freight-related projects, one of my PhD students is looking at crowd shipping using public transport, which is a dominant mode of transport in Singapore, where I'm from. And we've also done some life cycle assessment of commercial trucks, and this was done with my former student, Li Wei, who was actually among the audience here and now doing his PhD at Toronto. So happy to see him here as well. We've also been exploring a lot of work looking at urban vibrancy. So this is a topic of understanding urban activities, where people move to, where people consume, which has a lot of implications on freight as well. So I'm working with an urban planner on this, as well as a computer scientist. So it's quite exciting to see all this different disciplines coming together. But yeah, it just gives a flavor of the range of projects we're working on. So on e-commerce and cross-border shipping, let me give a little bit of context to the e-commerce market in Asia, perhaps. So here's a little map. When I saw it, was quite striking to look at the largest e-commerce markets last year. Things probably have evolved a little bit, but the dominance of China in terms of their e-commerce activities is quite clear. So e-commerce in China accounts for more than 50% of worldwide retail sales on the internet, and I think they overtook, they sort of achieved this level quite a few years ago. And the expansion is happening, not just the quantum is large, the rate is also quite large and faster than anywhere else in the world. So quite interesting. The same is true for Southeast Asia, where Singapore is based, along with Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Brunei, and so on. So this chart might be a little bit dated, but they all look very similar. It's always this very aggressive upward trend that we're looking at. And the key drivers of e-commerce in Asia is growth of internet connectivity and penetration. There's this concept of social commerce, so tapping on your social networks and encouraging your friends to buy in with all these sales happening in the online marketplaces. Part of it's also pushed by this lack of physical retail infrastructure. So if we visit cities, in Southeast Asia, you will see lots of retail malls, no problem. But if you start going out to the suburbs or to the rural areas, I think this lack of retail opportunities really pushes more people to buy things online. And there's this emergence of the growing middle class, so growing affluence would then also result in greater spending. So lots of drivers charging this growth upward. Just to give you some images to have in mind, just to portray what's happening other than numbers and charts. So here are just some images of warehouses in Southeast Asia, some delivery practices. So cash on delivery in Vietnam, the example shown in the middle at the top is quite common. So the payment, many of these platforms are not only e-commerce platforms to sell things, but they're also like payment platforms. They try to incorporate that. And then the example at the bottom left shows how they're trying to think of green initiatives. So electric delivery bikes, I think it's a small fraction of the total fleet, but is something that's being explored now. I mean, the two-wheeler vehicle population as part of the total vehicle population is very large. So it makes a lot of sense to move some of these motorcycles that deliver goods to electric versions. And then something more familiar for me, the unloading cargo in Singapore on the bottom right. Feel free to ask questions at any time. I'll try to address them. So cross-border e-commerce as a subset of the total e-commerce market, and it's just defined as the business of selling things online to other buyers in foreign countries rather than within the domestic market. So this is right now on average accounts for about 20% of global e-commerce spending. But in different markets, this number could vary. So in Singapore's case, for example, about more than half, 55% of our global e-commerce sales comes from across the border. And this is also growing very quickly. So this little map that I'm showing over here was produced by PayPal back in 2014, and they termed the report modern spice routes. So, like the traditional old spice routes of the past, this sort of represents how goods from the global market reaches everywhere else. So these are some of the dominant markets. The US is listed, China, Australia, Brazil. Canada is also mentioned over here. So you can see how this interlinkages is growing quite a lot, and we have, in a sense, the world is open, right, for any merchant to come forward and put out their goods. So this rise in cross-border e-commerce is growing rapidly. I mean, this is slightly dated, some of the statistics. There actually are quite a lot of market surveys and figures out there. I think all of them throwing slightly different numbers, but I think the general consensus is that cross-border e-commerce is growing, and it's expected to grow much faster than the domestic e-commerce sales. So why is it so popular? Cheaper prices, even after accounting for the shipping costs associated with bringing these goods to the shoppers, and access to products that are not easily available within the domestic market. So these are strong reasons, strong motivations why people are interested in accessing more goods worldwide. The story comes with, of course, some negative externalities. I think many of us are familiar with these trade-offs often when we think about transportation. So freight emissions, international freight emissions in particular, it's going to be more challenging to deal with given the longer distances that the goods now have to travel to get to the consumer. And this generates considerable carbon emissions. So there's some estimates of the carbon emissions from global freight transport to grow by 4 times by year 2050 from 2010 values. And then these freight sort of networks and chains are a lot more complicated, more complex, tends to be less efficient, especially if the market tends to be more fragmented with many players trying to compete in the transport service space. Or it can be more carbon intensive if we think of more trucks, reliance on more long haul trucks to deliver them, or the use of air freight, which is a lot more carbon intensive than other cleaner modes. Right. So if we look at the demand side, I mean, we've seen the overall picture and the context of growth in cross-border e-commerce. If we look at the demand side and the consumers and what they're expecting or preferring, I think many consumers now, and many of us are also consumers ourselves shopping online, there is a high expectation of free shipping that's apparent. So many of these studies on shipping preferences tend to come from the business school or marketing studies that have tried to uncover a little bit more about the consumer's mindset and the psyche. A lot of these studies also come from market surveys that are put out. But again, most of them have generally agreed that people like free shipping. They expect free shipping. In terms of the factors that matter when we decide the shipping options that are posed to us on these platforms, on these e-commerce platforms, cost matters, speed matters. Even the value of the order, the transaction that's being made also matter to consumers, and that would influence your shipping choice. Cost happens to be the most important factor. So this was discovered in a couple of studies referenced also. And that consumers tend to trade off between the quality of the service, speed, versus the cost of the service. So, the faster you get your thing, you're going to have to pay more for it, right? Not all consumers, however, need fast shipping. So sometimes the option is either it's a limited set of options that you can choose from, and then you just pick the faster one, maybe because the marginal cost is not that high, despite not having an immediate need for the item. So in this particular survey, 47% of online shoppers polled chose the faster shipping option because it's available, despite not having an immediate need for the item. So this is a bit concerning, again, relating back to the context of freight emissions as an impact. So when Chiu Hong and I looked at this context and thought about a potential research question to look at, we were considering the idea of carbon labeling. This is not a new idea. I think this has been introduced in many other products and have been found already to help, especially for consumers that are already more eco-conscious, which is I think it's a growing, my sense is it's a growing number of consumers tend to be more eco-conscious, and they are found to be quite strongly influenced with the presence of labels. So if you give them information, they will take that into account when they make their decisions on consumption, on consuming or buying between different options. As one example, if carbon labels were made available on travel booking websites, then this particular study in the middle, the second bullet point over here, talks about how the potential annual savings of CO2 might be around the order of 79 metric tons per year. So here's a little example shown on the left, which shows Tripit, which is a nice app which helps you compute or assess your carbon footprint for different flights if you were to put that in. And it might help you decide or make some decisions. So we did find one study that looked at eco-labels for shipping, e-commerce shipping. It was a paper back in 2018, a conference paper that looked at millennials specifically. So a majority of millennials surveyed indicated willingness to wait longer, meaning delay their shipments if it was greener shipping, but only a smaller fraction of them would be willing to pay for greener shipping. So this was some of the findings. I think this is a good hint at the sentiment of the market, and but they limited the study only to millennials, so we wanted to expand that a little bit more. So this research, we were looking at carbon footprint of cross-border shipping options. Will carbon labeling have an impact on shipping preferences? And the approach that we took was to look at a particular e-commerce platform called Taobao, which some of you might be familiar with. So this is a very popular Chinese e-commerce website, very reasonable prices, and that's quite extensively used in a lot of the Chinese-speaking markets around China. So we're going to examine the case of online shopping transactions placed in Singapore, ordering on Taobao for goods that are based, that originate from China. And then following that, we're going to conduct a stated preference survey to understand how consumers might react to carbon labeling. So let's jump into how we went about doing this. So Taobao, like I said, very, very, very popular. So it specializes in business to consumer or C2C retailing, and most of the merchants are based in China. So it's actually quite dominant in the Asian e-commerce marketplace, ranked as one of the top 10 e-commerce sites, and as a subsidiary of Alibaba, a very very big company, operates in more than 200 countries and more than 1 billion products listed. So it's a little bit overwhelming about how much is available here. So Taobao actually offers a set of different shipping options. And as a consumer, when you go in, you can actually consider these options. And then for accounting in terms of the carbon impact, we will be including these different stages here, A to E. So the options are mentioned in blue. So very typically, there are multiple sellers that might appear in your order. And then if you have multiple orders in one transaction, you can consider consolidating the order into one parcel or not. If you to have it shipped to you, you can choose sea or air freight. And then there's usually an option to have it delivered to your doorstep or delivered to a collection point, which could be a locker or a retail store that allows people to pick up their deliveries from. And then if you were to send it to a collection point, you can take different modes of transport to get there. So those are the options. And then in terms of the stages that we consider in this study, it's the different legs of the transport chain. So it's the truck transport within China to the port, the exiting port where the goods will come out from China. The cross-border transport, which could be either sea or air freight. The warehouse operations on both sides, both at the departure port as well as the arriving port in Singapore. And then the last mile delivery van transport within my city to get from the warehouse to the final parcel destination, which again could be the home or the collection point. All good so far? Okay, I'll keep going. Feel free to stop me if anything might be unclear. So in terms of shipping activity emissions, it's quite a straightforward calculation where we account for the emissions factor for different modes. So the total carbon emissions would be a function of the emission factor for the different modes multiplied by the distance traveled in kilometers versus multiplied by the tonnage or the weight of the particular parcel. It wouldn't be tons, it would be in the order of kilograms. So, but these emission factors are obtained from mostly government sources in the UK or Singapore where available. Yep. So for the stage A, which is the truck movement within China, we have some of these emission factors in kilograms of CO2 per ton kilometer. And then same for the ships or flights. And then the diesel van movement within Singapore, and then the passenger movement, which is stage E, which could be a private vehicle, private car at the customer's consumer's disposal, or public transport. Walking would not have any carbon impact. Okay, good. Other assumptions that we had to make. I'm going to be assuming 2 orders just to make it interesting to offer the option of consolidation or not. So we're going to assume this one transaction will have 2 different orders as part of our scenario to explore. And then the option to consolidate or not will be there. The parcels will be small, which is observed to be a majority of e-commerce parcels in Singapore anyway. And when we define the size, what we mean by small as well as the weight. The main departure city from China is the port city of Guangzhou in the south of China. So we're going to be assuming that these goods would travel the average distance from these e-commerce centers across China to Guangzhou eventually before engaging in that stage where it moves across the border. We have a warehouse emissions factor from another reference that we're going to be using, a value of 0.026 kilograms of CO2 per parcel day. So depending on how long it resides in the warehouse. If it's a consolidated delivery, it will actually require more time for that to happen. So we're going to add 1 day to the total delivery time. We had thought about accounting for the delivery failure rates, and eventually this didn't end up being a very sensitive parameter, but we put that in anyway, because in the last mile delivery, if the first delivery attempt fails, then the vehicle has to travel twice the distance, right, to make a second attempt. And then we found these figures from a local e-commerce carrier in Singapore. So the first, delivery failure rate for the first attempt is 5.9%. Second attempt would be 26.2 and then 47.1. So these were just used as part of the last mile delivery stage. So here are some first set of results that shows the comparison of shipping options. So different options presented in the different columns. Again, you can see the different options in terms of sea or air freight, consolidated or not, final destination being the doorstep home or to a collection point, and then the passenger trip mode, travel mode, walking or car or bus. I simplified. I only showed these 5 here for now. And then these are the cost and delivery time, shipping time, as well as the total carbon emissions estimate for each of these options for a parcel that's about 1 kilogram. So not too heavy, small parcels. And if we were to chart out the carbon emissions for them, we can see that the option where you go for sea freight is the lowest net emissions. I think intuitively we sort of already knew that just by looking at the emission factors of different modes. You can already see how flights tend to have a very high carbon footprint, a very high emissions factor compared to shipping, 2 orders of magnitude. So the impact, if you were to choose air, is going to be much higher compared to sea freight. If we were to break it down, again, the cross-border transport is the most sensitive parameter. The rest of them tend to be marginal or small. But it's quite apparent, the difference, right? I mean, across this option of sea versus air freight. The cheapest option tends to be the slowest and the lowest carbon emitting option. So option 1. So this, I guess this implies that, as a consumer, if you can wait a little bit for your shipment, you can actually lower the carbon footprint associated with that shipping option. Okay. I'll pause for a moment just in case you want to take a look at the table. Okay, I'll keep going. So the next thing we did was to look at shipping choice experiment. So the objective was to look at the willingness to for consumers to either delay their shipments or pay more for a less carbon intensive option. So for simplicity, for this experiment, I'm only going to be looking at single order transactions, so just 1 order. There's no question about consolidation or not, and it's to be delivered to the consumer's home. So we're cutting out some of these options here. We're going to be exploring different levels of the order value. If you order, if the item that you've purchased online, is it low or high value? Maybe that makes a difference. Carbon label presence, yes or no. And then we're going to, again, explore this trade-off between time as well as cost, right? Given the information is being present or not. Okay, so let's see how this is set up. And so here's the full factorial design of the scenarios. There are 12 of them. So again, 2 levels for the order value high or low, 2 levels of whether the carbon label is present or not. No, it's not indicated by X, or yes, it is indicated by O. And then we're looking at this trade-off between cost and speed. So it could be a slower option, could end up being cheaper, like we have seen with the Taobao example earlier. Or the faster option might be cheaper, or both might be at the same price. Again, this is repeated across these options. Okay, so 12 scenarios, and then we present these to survey respondents. So this is an example of some of the options presented. So scenarios 7 and 8 shown over here are sort of presented in this form to the people that we surveyed. I'll tell you a bit more about the survey profile, respondent profile a little bit later. But we present to them, option 1 and 2. So some of them could be slower delivery. This is the cost associated with that shipping. You are ordering a $30 item that's 1 kilogram. So which would you pick? Right? So in scenario 7, no carbon information was provided. In scenario 8, we actually show it. So the greener option takes a longer time here. In scenario 8, it's actually cost lower. It's actually cheaper to choose this option as well. So let's explore what people chose. Here's the breakdown of, like a profile of who came forward and participated in our survey. So this survey was run back in June and July last year, and it was among adult residents in Singapore with some experience buying things online from across the border. So we got about 200 over respondents after filtering out those that were incomplete or invalid. We were left with 188 responses, which is a bit lower than I had hoped, but let's explore what we learn out of it for now. The gender split is 62% female versus 38% male, which is fairly close to some of the market surveys that we have found that have profiled the characteristics of online shoppers in Singapore. The age split is a little bit biased towards the younger demographic. Again, I would have hoped to have spread this out a little bit. But most online shoppers in Singapore range about 18 to 34 years old. Has been found from market studies. So again, split in monthly income and also a variety in online purchasing frequency. So here are some of the survey outcomes. Let me explain what's happening in this table over here. So again, it's split into what was presented to them in the different rows. So in this first row and category, the slower option is presented as cheaper. And the behavior here is what the respondent in this categories, the percentage or number of respondents is shown in the number. I hope you can see my mouse moving, my mouse cursor moving. So this is a number of respondents who committed to these, revealed this behavior, and the percentage of the respondents. So in this group, in the very first row over here, they chose a cheaper option for the case of when the label is there or not. So regardless of whether the carbon information was presented, they chose the cheaper one. So cost mattered to them. These are the cost-sensitive people, and you can see it's a very high fraction, which is a bit what we were anticipating. I guess it's not too surprising. Cost sensitivity is there. And then the second row over here. So this is where even when presented that the slower option is cheaper, they wanted a faster option. So speed mattered more to this group, this 30 respondent with the high order value, or at least 13 individuals with the low order value, right? Yep. So we can see some of them actually exhibited information about the carbon. So in this case, For the first two rows, the carbon information didn't really profile, right? Whether it's shown or not, the behavior was consistent. In this case, in the third row, the faster option was chosen when no information was provided. And then when the carbon label was included, they chose the slower option, the lower impact option, effectively. So carbon mattered over speed over cost, right? So we were able to then, sort of categorize all these different respondents and sort of revealed some of their overall preferences. So the underlying preferences were revealed for in terms of whether they prioritize cost over carbon over speed, like in the first row over here, and the number of respondents who displayed that this set of preferences. So we were to look at the respondents that were willing to compromise the speed for the greener alternative, meaning you choose the slower delivery because it's less carbon intensive. We found that 55% of them were willing to do that. And of this group, a quarter of them were willing to pay more for the greener alternative. So not too different from that one other conference paper that we found. In this case, maybe spread out to a wider audience. And I would like to explore this a little bit more. So in terms of future work and limitations, I hope to scale up the survey to understand maybe a bit more about the demographics and other characteristics that might influence the shipping preferences. This study focused more on the demand side, but the supply side is also equally interesting to look at the impacts of slower deliveries. What does it mean if we give people more time to consolidate? What is the cost implications? What is the supply chain implications, and so on? And then, it's not like the e-commerce platforms might necessarily want to include carbon labels in their shipping options today. So I think that's something to be investigated as well. I think I saw one article about how Amazon actually moved away from this option because they were concerned that people might not click through with their purchases if this information was presented. So I think, again, there is strong potential with what we've observed, but whether or not we can actually implement it, that's a different question. So emissions can vary considerably for different shipping options. Slower shipments cost and emit less, so something to consider as consumers, all of us. These emissions are most sensitive to the choice of sea or air freight, and slightly over half of the surveyed shoppers in Singapore were willing to wait for greener shipping if the labels were there. So the strong potential, I think, to consider including this in some of our these e-commerce platforms. Okay, that's my last slide. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I was coherent. Again, hope forgive me if I wasn't, but happy to take any questions and clarify.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. And I do have a question. Sundar, would you like to unmute and ask your question? And others, would you like to post questions in the chat or put up your hand? And I'll call you. Thanks.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I guess my question was trying to get into the how the survey was conducted, especially how the respondents were recruited. Are they from a panel? Just to understand, is there any kind of bias or preference towards sustainable methods of transport?
Yeah. Yes. We didn't have a large budget to extend the survey too much, so it was mostly recruited through the networks of the student and advertised in public forums and so on. So again, if we had more time and budget, I think we would have expanded the survey a little bit more. I would have liked to see a larger sample size, perhaps. But in terms of the bias, again, we had tried to cross-check that with some of the market survey of online shoppers in Singapore, just to check that our numbers are not too far off. It's a little bit different, but I would say not too far off from the profile of online shoppers in Singapore. They tend to be younger, more female than male, etc.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? I'm looking in the chat. And for raised hands, I know we have some e-commerce people on the call. There we go. To, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Lynette.
Hey, nice to meet you again.
Yeah, nice to
Nice to see you
meeting
here.
Okay.
Yeah. So could you please pop up the presentation? I would like to
Yes,
ask
sure.
a question. Yeah.
Mhm.
About the result. I
Yes.
think now previous one. Yeah, this one. So what tools do you use to have this underlying preferences?
Yeah, I think this was derived from here, right? So we were able to categorize the respondent based on their responses to the choices that were presented to them, which sort of reviewed. We had, of course, presented a few options just to make sure they're not inconsistent in their response. So they had to answer multiple times so that we can see what is the underlying preference that drives their behavior. So we first had to categorize them into which behavior type. So we sort of put different labels to the type that they belong to, and then distill the next step, which is what you were asking about, whether it was costs that mattered more to them, so the cost sensitive individuals are formed the largest bin, right?
Yeah.
And then there were some, but in a sense, in the first row, for example, this group actually prioritized carbon over speed. So they were willing to, okay, I'm not going to pay, I'm not willing to pay, but I don't mind waiting longer if I know that my shipment is going to be less carbon intensive.
Yeah, I see. So could you please move to slide 16?
16, oh, sure.
Yeah. So yeah, you have people to put their preferences, but I mean the cost in here, I see like some options like 13.8 or 13.4. Something is like not really like significant different, right?
Right. Yeah, in this case, again, these cost figures came from the platform itself. So these were the, after we sort of put in the choices, given the number of all the different variations and shipping options available. This is the values that came out from the platform. So it's in a sense the actual numbers, or at least for a few examples. I think you could do this over maybe a wider range of product types or a wider range of product sizes. You might get more variation. This is just one example to show what the trade-off is going to be. We were trying to use this to guide the choice experiment actually. In order to help us determine like the right levels to show, just to make sure that it's fairly realistic.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know whether like how like significant between the option 4 and option 5, if we only see the cost, the carbon emission, and the travel time, right?
Yeah.
It's very close.
We simplified it for the choice experiment though. We didn't include consolidation options. We didn't include collection point. We just said, okay, it's just a single package delivered to your home. It's going to cost this range. And then we're going to present it. Yeah. So the key during the experiment was just to simplify and just to tease out this underlying preference and behavior and likely behavior.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Judy, you are on mute.
Thanks, sorry. We're going to Meng Qing now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have a question about the delivery failure rate. I think in the slide about the assumption, you talk about delivery failure rate, the first attempt, second attempt. I just think that information is very interesting. I wonder how you use that information in your study.
Right. So that was used in the calculation of the carbon footprint for the very last mile delivery stage. So if you look at the different stages that we considered, this last mile stage D, last mile delivery van transport, if assuming that a fraction of them encountered failure rate at the beginning, it's a very modest amount anyway, then they would have to make they have to travel longer distances, like double the distance, in order to get to the end destination point.
Okay.
yeah, and then second time, actually, for this particular e-commerce carrot, that's what they were sharing that they did. They will try 3 times, and if it doesn't work, then they'll just return back to the seller. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I also have a follow-up question if I have time. So for stage A, carbon footprint calculation, I know on the Taobao there are so many different commerce, right? So I wonder how you decide. Those products are coming from different cities, different provinces. How do you decide like where the products come from?
Right.
And how do you do the stage A calculation?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mengqing. So we looked at it was hard to tell, right, where there's so many products on Taobao, where do they all come from? So what we did was we looked at these e-commerce zones that were specified in China. So I don't know whether you can see the map, it's a little bit small, but Guangzhou, which is the departure port, is shown at the bottom at the little red dot at the south of China. And then these gray dots are these e-commerce zones that have been demarcated by the Chinese government as places where that supports the export of goods, I think. So we took the average distance of these, I think there are like 20 over e-commerce zones to Guangzhou as the distance that the truck has to travel in stage A. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
This map was actually created by Liwei, so I want to acknowledge and thank him for helping me with this.
And I have now a question from Anlio. Anlio, go ahead.
Thanks. This information, actually, there's other great info behind this, I'm sure. I was curious to see, there was some overlap in the speed of delivery between the air and the sea. And I was curious to see if there's any indication of how sensitive people are to cost changes if that spread were wider. For example, kind of a 1 to 3 day air versus a 10+ day sea.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think we wondered about that as well, whether we should simplify it and look at maybe the midpoint of these days, for example. But we wanted to reflect, the reality that was observed in Taobao. So we actually just reported the range as it was found in the Taobao case. We didn't explore this particular question of whether this range, if it's more variation, how do people take to it? I think there's a lot of there'll be more uncertainty, right, with the results. So we didn't explore this in particular, but I think it's a good one to think about in the next iteration.
Great, thanks.
Okay, scanning down and seeing no more questions. I wish I'd thought to ask people to identify themselves before they spoke, because Lynette, it's really just great news. We had questions from our Provincial Ministry of Transportation, students, postdoctoral fellows, and also shippers who are part of the e-commerce delivery system. So a lot of diverse interest in this talk. And
nice.
And yeah, very, very nice. And therefore, this Smart Freight Center Leadership Seminar Series doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to bring a lot of people together. Here we are online talking to Singapore, so they could be anywhere. But mostly from our region. I guess maybe we'll do something about increasing our reach, I suppose. But that was great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to close by saying thank you very much. Everybody who joined us, thank you, especially Lynette. You gave everybody a lot to think about, obviously provoked a lot of great questions. We hope you enjoyed today's talk. We hope you stay tuned to see about our next talk, which will be coming down along in a couple of months. Everybody still stay safe and stay happy, stay well. I'm going to ask Guzman if he has any closing comments.
Thank you, Lynette, for your great presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And you all have a great weekend.
Great. Yes. Thanks, everybody.
Yes. Thank you very much.